the end of March 2020 and there still hasn't been a successor to either the Sony A7 III or the Canon EOS R yet. So that obviously begs the question, which one should you get for filmmaking in 2020? My name is Damien Cooper and welcome to Monkey Pixels.
We've got some fresh new young talent doing some things that I know you haven't heard before.
1, 2, 3, listen.
In this video, I will talk about the filmmaking side of things, but in a later video I will also give you my opinion on the photography side, but for now, let's talk about filmmaking. We've been testing the Sony A7 III as well as the Canon EOS R for quite a while now, because we were thinking about making the switch from our Canon over to Sony for several reasons, and I will give you a couple of those reasons and let you decide if you think the Sony or the Canon is better for filmmaking. So where the Sony A7 III comes in at about $2,000 on BH Photo and the Canon EOS R only cost you about $1,800, they're fairly close in price, so this definitely isn't a point for either of these cameras. So let's get into the nitty-gritty. So before we have this topic hang over our head for the rest of the video, let's talk about colors, because I know everybody's raging about how good Canon colors are, but let's not really focus about the colors in particular, but let's talk about color profiles, because this is something that's very important to us filmmakers out there. Whereas Canon only has the option of a handful color profiles like the standard profiles, faithful, standard and so on, and then they also have the C-Log as one of their flat profiles. But there I actually think we have a winner, because C-Log is definitely the best flat profile that I have seen for an 8-bit codec in any camera yet. Yes, the Sony has way more options, but especially when it comes to the S-Log profiles, I think the curve is way too aggressive and way too hard to expose for an 8-bit codec. And it's really hard to actually get it right because you only have 100 Mbits to work with, and I don't think this is the codec you want to go for when it comes to a really low bitrate, which the Sony cameras have. And I think C-Log is definitely the best mixture between two worlds. And yes, going back to the colors, if you don't really want to shoot flat and you use one of their other profiles like faithful and standard, and if I have a job that requires a really quick turnaround and I don't have any time for color grading, I would always choose the Canon and their standard profiles over the Sony and their profiles. But we also have a comparison between C-Log and HLG3, and I linked that video up here so you can check it out for yourself. Next up, let's talk about slow motion, and this point definitely and easily goes to the Sony, because the Sony has a full sensor readout with 120 frames in 1080p, which the Canon EOS R just doesn't offer. It does have 120 frames in 720p, but even there it doesn't even have autofocus. So when it comes to the regular slow motion, Sony is a definite winner, and since we're shooting a lot of sports and sometimes even these dreamy feelings on the beach or wherever, it's definitely nice to have the option of shooting 120 frames. And this was one of the biggest reasons we were thinking about switching to Sony, because Canon in general really does lack a lot of high frame rate options in their cameras, even in the cinema camera department. So if you really shoot a lot of slow motion, then you might really want to go to the Sony, because this one is actually better when it comes to slow motion, hands down, than any Canon. Next up, let's talk about our codec options. And this one isn't really a clear winner for either, because it does have its advantages and disadvantages on either side. So on the one hand, we have Sony's low bitrate codecs, which is obviously great if you want to shoot a lot of content and you don't want it to take up too much space on your hard drives. It's also great because you don't need a really expensive card, because the 100 Mbit codec is really easy to your SD cards, and this is obviously an advantage of the Sony cameras. But only shooting in a really low bitrate like 50 Mbits in 1080 or 100 Mbits in 4K also has its disadvantages. Like I already mentioned in the color profile section, that with 100 Mbit you don't really have a lot of wiggle room when it comes to post-production, because a 100 Mbit 4K codec definitely falls apart quicker when it comes to color correction in post. And then on the other hand, you have Canon's really high bitrate codecs, whereas their 1080p codec is 1.8 times bigger than Sony's 4K codec, and their 4K codec in comparison is 4.5 times as big as Sony's. Again, it doesn't really fall apart that easily in post-production, so that is definitely a great thing. And I also feel sometimes that the overall image quality therefore is a little bit richer, but then again you have the disadvantage of needing bigger and more expensive SD cards, and it definitely takes up a lot more hard drive space. So that is one thing to keep in mind. So this category is kind of even in my opinion. So one thing we obviously need to talk about when comparing these two cameras is image quality. But image quality often is a little bit subjective. We are only shooting 1080p on our Canon EOS R, and I think the 1080p is hands down better than the 1080p of the Sony. But the 4K on the Sony is definitely sharper than the 1080p on the Canon EOS R. So the Sony is definitely sharper when it comes to image quality than the Canon, hands down. But sometimes I prefer a little bit of a softer look when it comes to my cinematic edits, but that is obviously subjective as well. When I'm shooting a lot of corporate videos, I actually like having it really crisp and sharp, so this is something that the Sony definitely does better. When it comes to these cinematics and short films, I really like that smoother look that the Canon produces because it gives the whole look a little bit more of a cinematic feel. But then again, this is my subjective opinion, so I kind of think it's a wash, and I would love to have the option to produce sharper images with the Canon, and I also would like to have a little bit of a smoother, more cinematic look when it comes to the Sony. So I think this is a wash. Now let's talk about usability, and this is somewhat of a broad category, but let me just kind of give you my opinion on that. I never really liked using the Sony in so many ways, because the menu is really hard to get into. You don't really have a touch screen on the back, so it's even more fiddly to get through all these hundreds of menu points that you actually have, and that is something I definitely prefer on the Canon. Everything is where it's supposed to be, it's easy accessible, and that point definitely goes to the Canon in my opinion. But then again, it's also somewhat of an unfair comparison because the Sony just has so many more options to customize your camera, to go into the nitty-gritty. But then again, when I was using the Sony for a long time, I didn't really use most of these features, and I kind of find them annoying when they are there and I'm not using them because they take up so much space of the menu and customizable options that I really like that the Canon is a lot more simple when it comes to their options. So that kind of, for me, goes to the Canon. Next up is the body itself, and I kinda like the Canon body more. It's a little bit bigger, and I really prefer the button layout of the Canon than the ones on the Sony. So when shooting with the Canon, I always like having the Canon in my hand better than the Sony. So here's one thing that is often overlooked on the Sony, and it's been annoying since I've been using the Sony A7 II way back in the day, and they still haven't fixed this problem, and this is file numbering. Whenever you format your card in the Sony and you start shooting again, it starts shooting with a file number of 001. So when you're using multiple cameras or you're shooting for the same project on different kind of days, it gets really annoying because you can't just dump your files onto your computer in the same folders, because then it wants to overwrite the already existing files. And then you need to start renaming your files, and it gets a little bit annoying. So this is something that, at least for me as a filmmaker, when using the Sony in my use case, was really annoying when it comes to the usability. But one thing I really don't like about the Canon, and I will include this under the category of usability, is using an external monitor for filmmaking. And obviously when we're shooting on a camera, we want to use an external monitor. But it really is a pain in the ass when using an external monitor with the Canon, because you don't have all the options that you can output to your external monitor, or with the usability and the new touch bar, it's kind of hard if you want to use autofocus with an external monitor, because there's really not a good way to choose your autofocus fields or even switch something, or even see your autofocus fields when filming. So the thing that the camera outputs while filming is still a pain when it comes to the Canon. So this is definitely way better on the Sony, because you can see everything clear as day on an external monitor, and you also have more information on your display while filming, and that is definitely a plus point for the Sony. So one point that definitely goes to the Canon is the ability to actually customize your buttons when it comes to run and gun filming. When shooting a documentary or wedding or live event, it's really handy that you have a control ring and then you have the touch bar on the back. So for example, we use the control ring to change our ISO and we use the touch bar on the back to change our white balance. So now you have everything really handy, and when you quickly need to make some changes on the fly, then the Canon is definitely the right tool for you. Obviously you have a lot of customizable buttons on the Sony, but I think the point still goes to the Canon because of the control ring and the touch bar, because I just found it way smoother to actually change settings on the fly while filming with the Canon than the Sony. Next up, and this was a big topic when the Sony came out, is lenses, because everybody just loves the choices that you have with Canon and all the EF lens lineup. But nowadays this isn't really a problem anymore, because Sony really caught up and all the Sony lenses from G Master to their size lenses are amazing, sometimes even better than their Canon counterpart. So this really is only a problem if you're really a specific sports or wildlife photographer and you really need that 800mm 2.8 lens or whatever it is that you can find with Sony. But when it comes to the regular zooms and prime lenses, I was really blown away by their lens choices. But now that you come up with the RF lenses, I think this point might actually go to Canon again, but I'm actually not sure, and I think this is a wash right now, because you have a lot of really great options when it comes to the new RF lenses. For example, I love our 28-70 2.0 and obviously all the other RF lenses like the 15-35, the 24-70 with image stabilization. So you have a lot of really great options that do come with a price though. But when it comes to lenses, I think it was like somewhat leaning towards the Sony a while ago, but now with the RF lenses, I think actually Canon caught up again. And this is a point that goes slightly to the Canon, but again, not a big deal. And our last category is features. And this is again somewhat of a broad category because I will just include everything that I haven't mentioned before. And obviously you've been waiting for this and I included this into features, and that is the ability of shooting with no crop in 4K, in 1080, in 120 frames on the Sony. And that option you just don't have on the Canon. And yes, the 4K has a massive 1.8 times crop, and this is really annoying and probably the reason why we're not using 4K at all. Besides that, the codec is so hard drive intensive. So these are options. I would love to have a better 4K codec in it that has no crop on the Canon EOS R, and we would probably shoot way more 4K if it was a no crop option. But since we don't have that option, it's definitely something that goes to the Sony. And another feature is that you can record externally on the Canon with a 10-bit 422 codec, and you just don't have that option on the Sony. Yes, it's only in 4K, so it's only in the crop mode, and I don't really understand why, because I would love to have the option to externally record 1080p in 10-bit on the Canon, which we don't. But again, having the option is definitely better than not having the option at all. Another really cool feature on the Canon is your manual focus assist. So you have this little square in the middle of your screen that actually helps you focusing when focusing manually. And I think this is a really cool feature and makes focusing manually way easier on the Canon than on the Sony. Let's talk about autofocus. And a lot of people prefer shooting manual focus when it comes to video work, but obviously there's also a place for autofocus. And we use autofocus a lot when shooting video for interview setups where face detection is really a cool thing to have. And this point would definitely have gone to the Sony a couple months back, but now that they came up with the upgrade for the Canon EOS R, I think they're pretty even when it comes to their autofocus capabilities. You do have a couple weird restrictions in either camera. For example, you don't have autofocus when shooting 120 frames in 720p on the Canon EOS R, and you don't have face detection autofocus when using an external monitor on the Sony, or you don't have face detection autofocus when shooting 120 frames. But overall, the capabilities are pretty even, and I think this is also a tie. And one last thing I want to talk about before we make a decision here is that one thing I wrote down when I prepared to make this video is that I don't really have a lot of trust in the future of the company when it comes to Canon and producing video cameras for their clients, because I was always really annoyed by their restrictions on their camera that really feel like they shouldn't be there and they just implemented them to save other camera lines. But now that the EOS R5 has been announced and this one seems like a complete monster without any restrictions, although it's too early to tell right now, I kind of want to not talk about this point right now because it gives me a lot of hope to actually put my trust into Canon as a camera manufacturer when it comes to entry-level cameras with video functions. So let's hold our horses and wait for the new releases for Canon and Sony before I will lose my trust into Canon. So it's time to make a decision, and I think you could already tell that these cameras are really close when it comes to the capabilities of shooting video. Either cameras has their advantages and disadvantages, and I think it really depends on what you use this camera for and which of the features are more important to you and which aren't. For us, we chose the Canon EOS R for the flip out screen, the lenses and the codec options, and especially the colors and the C-Log profile. But again, it's really close and you can go either way. It really depends on your use case. If you really use a lot of slow motion and you need that 120 frames, or you really want to shoot 4K at a lower bitrate, then the Sony is probably the one for you. But for us, we really like the Canon, but it might actually be a little bit of a personal preference. But I hope this video gave you a lot of overview over what each of these cameras can do in the video shooting department, and I hope for you to subscribe to our YouTube channel if you're interested in more videos like that and the comparison for photography as well in the near future. My name is Damien Cooper and I'll hope to see you on the next one.